Hi, everybody. I see everybody's logging on, so we'll give it a couple minutes. Thanks for joining today. We had quite a few folks register for this, so really great to see everyone's faces and or names or profile pictures. So I'll just cover some basics here while everyone is logging on. Usually these first few minutes of a Zoom conference call, people are sorting out their audio and video, so hopefully you can see me. If you're not too familiar with Zoom, you probably will be over the next couple of weeks. I know lots of folks have recently found themselves needing to join Zoom conference calls. So you should automatically be on mute when as you come on here, and that's okay. If we will have some time for questions later on in towards the end of this, but for now just keep yourself on mute, and you can unmute later if you absolutely have a burning question. I will still ask you to refrain till the end because it's a little unwieldy with the 100 and some folks on this call. So looks like we've got 62 here so far. One thing I would like you to chime in on though, and you can do this through the chat function. The chat function is at the bottom of the screen. If you hover over your Zoom application window on your, if you're on your desktop, it's the fourth icon to the right there. It'll open up a chat window. You can say, hi, everyone. You can go ahead and try that out, say hi. And I'm gonna check that to make sure that you can hear me, that you can see the screens that I'm sharing at a particular time. And then, yay, everybody saying hi. So as you can see, thank you for checking in and saying where you're from. And I'll just ask, can you hear me or can you see my screen? If a couple of folks can either give thumbs up or say yes in there, then that will help me out. All right, we are recording this, and so if for any reason you do not want your name or image to appear anywhere on the screen, the default is that it just records me and my screen here. But if you have any issues with that and you're not able to like hide your name or hide your screen for some reason, just go ahead and email us at @FontesMedia, and we'll edit that after the fact and make sure that your name and image is not on the recording, okay? All right. Okay. I will probably not be able to get to all the questions if you do show them in here in the chat, just because it's going quickly. And I know there is there's a raise hand feature. Joel asked that question, but I don't think we're going to use that today. I'm just going to we may use that at the end when we open it up for questions. We'll see how it works. Okay. But we have a lot of ground to cover, and I'm going to put this, I'm going to change my view here so you all can see me, hopefully. There, you have a few different gallery views that you can adjust to see. You select who you see. I am going to share my screen and a few things as we go along in this meeting. So let me just pull something up really quick. All righty. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We're doing this Zoom conference call about how to figure out what's true in the news. And we're doing this on March 23rd. And if you're watching this recording, we're in the middle of, a really unprecedented time in the United States where we're, about 1 in 4 Americans is basically at home, kind of ordered to be at home and social distance because of the coronavirus pandemic. And it's a really unusual time. It's a really anxious and stressful time for a lot of folks. So I really appreciate you jumping on this call right now so that we can connect and we can discuss something that is related to all this, which is the news and how to trust the information in our information ecosystem. I know that a lot of folks have anxiety not only about the health of themselves, the health of others, economic uncertainty, job uncertainty, And that leads to all sorts of things like mental health issues and things of that nature. But one of the things that exacerbates it is the fact that we're sitting there reading news all the time, and a lot of us I know have gotten really angry because we see misinformation out there. We see the fact that in a lot of cases, bad information has made the problems that we already have much worse. So thank you for joining me today, and so we can work through these issues, and we can talk about how to figure out what's true in the news. I'm going to share my screen with you here, and we do have a lot to cover. So I'm going to speak quickly. That's kind of my jam. I speak quickly. So there's not much I can do about that except for try to speak more slowly from time to time. But when I get really excited, I just get going. So if you need any clarification, just know that there will be a recording of this, and you should be able to go back and re-listen to it. If something's bugging you, you can try to get my attention in the chat as well. All right. So this is called How to Figure Out What's True in the News, and you'll see. Can you all see that in the?
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Cool. What's true in the news. So I have a little caveat here. What this should be called is how to figure out what's likely true in the news. And why do I say that? Well, you guys can still see my PowerPoint, right? The
No.
first slide there? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
How to figure out what's flat true and
Okay. All right, perfect.
Nice and clear.
Perfect. So we're going to get comfortable with the fact that you can almost never know if something is 100% true or 100% false. Now that may strike you as very disappointing because the title of this is how to figure out what's true in the news. But again, a more accurate title would be how to figure out what's likely true in the news. And today, in talking about the subject of truth, we're going to cover a lot of concepts, many of which draw on fields of philosophy, cognitive psychology, law, media literacy, and epistemology. And I know that a lot of you on the phone here are educators, and many of you may have backgrounds, maybe even advanced degrees, PhDs in some of these fields. And you know that when we touch on these concepts, there's a lot more depth we could go into. But the challenge in today's news environment is how to help people understand what's likely true, even if they've never taken a philosophy or a psychology class.
Right.
Everyone is getting access to information, and it can't just be that only people who are very, very, very educated can figure out what's true and what's not, right?
We want to, you, Henry.
Yeah, so we want to make the skill of distinguishing reliable news information accessible to everyone. So we're really going to focus on practicality and examples here, okay? So what we're going to start with is throwing out some binary definitions that a lot of us are used to, and especially a lot of folks who maybe haven't taken philosophy classes or psychology classes, things like that, are not used to. So we're going to throw out the false binary of true or false.
Right.
And I think when we learn this true false binary, when we're young, maybe it's first, second, third grade, we tend to learn it using very simplistic examples like Thomas Jefferson was the first president, true or false? And because that's a historical fact, we know George Washington was the first president, we say, oh, that's false. But most statements, especially statements in the news, are not just a simple binary of true or false. So there's the more useful way of categorizing truthfulness is on a scale. And you will see this in various fact-checking organizations, okay? So there are a number of really good ones out there. Advantage Media is not a fact-checking organization, okay? We are a news content rating organization. We rate the content of the news, and we give it a score. So what we, let's see. Oh, just gotta, I think some people are getting feedback, so just somebody wanted to there's a reminder for everybody to go on mute. So thank you for that. I'm going to share a screen from my my internet browser here. Okay, so here are two fact-checking news sites. Here's PolitiFact and Snopes. These are both great resources. We'll revisit them later. But I wanted to show you their truthfulness scales. Truthfulness scales for PolitiFact, they have a truthometer. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 levels, okay? True, mostly true, half true, mostly false, false, and pants on fire. And what's important to realize about this is that it is a gradient. It's not just a binary true or false. So we're just not accustomed to thinking that way, unfortunately. We want to accuse, when we think something's not true, people will get mad at the New York Times or Washington Post when if the president says something that they view as not true, they say, why don't they just call that a lie? And it's not as simple as calling things truth and lies all the time. Same thing with Snopes. Can you see my browser that shows the Snopes screen? So they also have they actually have a number of other ratings, but when it comes to veracity, true, mostly true, mixture, mostly false, false, and unproven. And discarding this binary in the first place is extremely helpful. All right, where my meeting controls go? Okay, I'm gonna go back to sharing my PowerPoint presentation. So hopefully you can see that. So we use a veracity scale at Adfontes Media when we are measuring the veracity of a particular article. Like I said, we do news content ratings. So that involves our analysts going through a number of different factors for reliability on the media bias chart vertical axis and bias for the horizontal media bias chart axis. And one of the factors for reliability is veracity. So there are definitions for true, for a 1 on, this is a scale of 1 to 5. 1 would be true, meaning that it's easily provable and widely accepted. 2 means it's mostly true, meaning it's mostly provable and mostly accepted. 3 means it's neither true nor false, neither provable nor disprovable, and subject to debate. And often we will also refer to this as an opinion, okay? 4 is mostly false, meaning mostly disprovable, and the facts disproving it are mostly accepted. And false is that it's easily disprovable, and the facts disproving it are widely accepted. So, the idea that like the universe of things that falls into widely accepted is actually really, really small. We disagree as humans on a lot of stuff. So unless it's something like that you can verify with your eyes, like the weather outside or a sports score, something that you don't have any reason to call into question, we typically don't, anything outside of that, we want to refrain from calling that facts, because people have beliefs about what's true that are not necessarily just these facts that are widely accepted. And beliefs about what's true are based on things like morality, experiences, things of that nature. Okay, so there are a few other things that fall into like things that we know that are true for certain. Like usually the best evidence is things we see and hear and experience ourselves. But that's a really limited universe of what we can see and hear and experience ourselves. The thing that right outside that we usually accept as facts, even though we haven't proven them ourselves, are like foundational scientific and historical principles. For example, George Washington was the first president. It's possible that that's not true, but then that would require like a lot of things to have gone wrong. Like everybody in history for all time since the first president of the United States has been trying to trick you and everybody else. That's really not likely. Okay, same thing like the Earth is round, or the boiling temperature of water is 212 degrees. So like I've never physically checked, you put a thermometer in a pot of boiling water to see if it actually boils at 212 degrees. However, I believe that just because of the widely accepted scientific principles, and if that wasn't true, it would break down a lot of the other things that we hold as true. Okay, so again, this gets really philosophical. I won't spend too much time on this, but I want to move on to something else that we measure that can help us determine whether something's likely to be true or not in the news. Okay, I want to throw out the false binary of fact versus opinion. Okay. All right, so let me just go back to this first one. Fact versus opinion. We also say this about the news, like news versus opinion, and that's not that simple either, okay? We typically learn fact and opinion in a simplistic fashion when we were young as well, like 1st to 3rd grade. Like, the sky is blue is a fact, and I like broccoli is an opinion, okay? But there's more useful ways of categorizing this concept, and we do it on a scale called the expression scale, okay? So the expression scale, it talks about how a sentence is phrased and presented, okay? So expression could be one is it's presented as a fact, like a declarative statement. 2 is presented as a fact with some analysis, and analysis, another word for that is context. Okay. Number 3 is presented as analysis. I'll just go through these and I'll just go back and give you a few examples. Number 4 is presented as analysis with some opinion, and 5 is presented as opinion. So analysis and opinion, words that we use that are similar to that are context and conclusions, okay? So the 2s and the 3s, analysis, the facts with some analysis, and the analysis statements, those are what people typically refer to as like news stories that give some context. So it's not just the facts. There's a limited universe of stories, news stories that are just the facts, because they tend to be a little bit boring. Like, this weather happened today, and like in this place and this time, or this accident happened at this place and this time. If it was about the coronavirus, for example, it would be something like here's how many people got sick, how many people died, where they were located, how fast it happened, and not even getting into the why. Okay, when you start getting into the why and what it means, then you start providing context, and context is somewhat synonymous with analysis here. Then when we get into deeper analysis and opinion, we're talking about conclusions. Okay, so conclusions are there are statements that can be supported or unsupported by facts. So on our expression scale, things that are like 1 would be like weather report type of stories, things that go fact, 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 that's it. Fact with some analysis would be like fact, 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 conclusion. Oh, somebody says, all right, can you guys see this presentation clearly on the expression? Okay.
Yes,
I can.
Okay, cool. All right. The number 3 would be like fact, fact, conclusion. A 4 would be like fact, conclusion, conclusion, conclusion. An opinion would be like just a bunch of conclusions. Okay. Okay. Now somebody can't see the whole slide, but I'm not sure why. Okay. All right. So at Adfontes, we rate articles for both veracity and expression, because they could overlap, but they don't all cover the same things. So for example, something could be expressed as a fact, and but it could be like, say something is presented as a fact, it's a declarative statement, right? But it could be like a 1 for veracity, like say it's raining outside and they said it's raining outside, that's a fact. Or if they state it as a fact for expression, okay, 1 for expression, but it's neither true nor false, such as government corruption is absolute. That's an opinion statement, so it gets a 3 on veracity. Or it could be false. So it could be stated as a fact, presented as a fact, but it's false. Like the earth is flat, all right? That would be, so that shows you a little bit of how veracity and expression are both really important parts of a thing to rate about a sentence for our purposes, or an article for our purposes, but it's, you kind of need both. Both are indicators of truthfulness. All right, so let's move on to a slightly different concept. We're still talking about things being 100% true or 100% false. And I want to recommend a really, really excellent book. It is called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. I'm going to share a window here, just so you can see it. Okay, so this book, can you guys see my screen? It says Annie Duke, Thinking in Bets.
Yes.
All right. Making smarter decisions when you don't have all the facts. This is super important to our discussion in the news. And Annie Duke is a world champion poker player, and she has a background in cognitive psychology. So she draws on lessons from both fields to teach people about a concept called probabilistic thinking. And probabilistic thinking is just one of the most useful things that you can do when you're trying to evaluate usefulness in the news. She talks about making decisions in all areas of life, but we'll focus on probabilistic thinking when it comes to truthfulness in the news. Okay, so one of the reasons, so we want to use this to stop thinking about things as absolutes, as if they're 100% true or 100% false. We want to determine what's probably true. And one of the reasons that people have become lost in knowing what to believe is because they have experiences when they're told something is 100% true or it's 100% false, and then that just turns out not to be so. Okay, if people can get really trapped in that. I'm sharing my screen again. Hopefully you can see that. All right. So there are reasons that people will mistrust scientific facts. So we'll talk about this just in terms of orientation to truthfulness, and then we'll apply this to the news. So reasons people might mistrust scientific facts is because they can point to examples where like a very old principles that were disproven long ago were like those exist, right? Like people used to think the earth was flat. So, but then like everybody thought the world was flat. Turns out that was wrong. The earth was round, and they'll point to that example, okay? They'll also point to more recent examples of studies that were replaced and updated by improved studies. Annie Duke also talks about this in her book, but for a long time, the scientific literature around nutrition was about how fat in your diet causes fat. It causes you to be fat. And it turned out not to be true. It turned out to be more about calories and sugar. And then as a result, we experience a lot of, bad health effects in people's diets and people's health over the years. And that those old beliefs have been updated by better studies, okay? And that's a valid reason to always have room for possibility that what you believe is not necessarily so, okay? So the other reason that people lose trust in scientific facts or just lose trust in general is because they can point to folks who trust in science, legitimately trust in science, but then they claim absolute certainty, even though they don't, you can't have absolute certainty, right? So the common examples right now, things where we have like really good evidence that they are so because of the best available scientific evidence right now. Things that are so are things like, climate change is caused by humans and it's going to have catastrophic effects in the future if we don't do something about it, right? Or vaccines do not cause autism, right? So, but this is like the scientific consensus of like large groups of people who are experts in these fields, like meta studies of other studies, these kinds of groups of information that rely on a large scientific community to validate. But even within those scientific communities, there are dissenters. There are edge cases, like within like vaccine science, for example. There is there is a thing that's true, that there are side effects from certain vaccines, right? But often when people, in people's quest for people to accept the science around vaccines not causing autism, because that's what the best available scientific evidence shows, they will discard and discount edge cases that do exist, and then that's not very convincing to people who are focused on like actual edge cases. Like if somebody knows somebody in their lives that had a side effect from a vaccine, and you're discounting that, then like what you're saying is true versus what they're saying is true is like running up into conflict, and they're going to have to make a choice, right? So I say all this to encourage you to always, always, always leave room for the possibility that our most closely held beliefs could be updated with new information. Even our best scientific information now could be updated with new information in the future. It's always possible. Like you can be 99.9% sure based on the best available evidence, but not 100% sure, okay? For example, the Earth is round, right? We're pretty sure about that. We've like flown, we've like taken pictures from space, looked back at the Earth, it's round, right? Gravity, physics, all that is based on round Earth principles, okay? But it's possible that we are living in a computer simulation. It's possible that we're living in the Matrix. It's possible that we're all just, this is all in our imagination. Who knows, right? There's all these possibilities. Those are very, very, very unlikely, but always leaves room for possibility. It makes it easier to walk back when you have when you don't have so much certainty. So the biggest logical mistake that people make is thinking that because you can't know if something is 100% true, that you can't figure out when it has like a 99 or 95% chance of being true. And that's where people get lost in the news. Okay, so just because in olden times people were wrong that the Earth was flat, it doesn't mean that you can't be very sure that climate change is likely caused by humans and is a real threat. Okay, so I'm gonna take a look at a different slide here. Okay, so when you're thinking about probabilistic thinking, let's create a couple of definitions. Okay, so at the top you've got like certain. Again, very few things are certain, but things that we tend to have near 100% probability are things like that we see with our own eyes that are verified. Things that are almost certain, like the scientific principles and things that you just accept kind of without, like a boiling temperature of water, almost certain, 95 to 100%. The book Thinking in Bets is about like making good decisions based on the fact that if you had to bet on it, like you'd want to go around in the world making bets that have a high probability of coming true most of the time. You can be wrong sometimes, but if you go around betting on things that have a really low likelihood of being true, you're likely to run into like real problems in your life, okay? So let's call this range up here probable, okay? 60 to 80%. If you're 60 to 80% true that something is so, you can usually make a decision and move forward with that. Again, you might be wrong sometimes, but you can make a good decision going forward with that. More likely than not, in law, we call this standard a preponderance of the evidence standard, and in like in civil liability cases, that's what you have to prove, that it's more likely than not, like more than 50% chance that somebody was at fault for something. And again, in certain cases, you can make a decision based on that, right? Bringing it back to coronavirus stories right now, there's a lot, I'll touch on this a little bit later, but there's a lot of information and misinformation going around about this, okay? People who are taking action to stop the spread of coronavirus, like we're all taking a lot of action on it. And I assert that the reason that we're doing that is because we're in this probable range of like, we're pretty sure that based on what the scientists, epidemiologists are telling us, and the other evidence that is piling up, like people actually getting sick and dying, that it's very likely this would be a very bad epidemic if we do not take these precautions, right? The probability of that is very high. Now we have people that that don't accept this, right? They don't think that it's probable. They think that it's a much lower percentage. It's less likely it's more likely than not that we're overreacting, for example. So if you're making the wrong bet here, this has disastrous consequences, right? So most of us are making this bet as a society that if we take these precautions, we're going to increase our own health and safety. And I think that's a good thing. Okay, so let's go down to the bottom here. Stuff that's possible and plausible. Okay, stuff that's possible. That's really anything. Like I said, anything is possible. Like we could be living in the Matrix, we could be living in a computer situation. Okay. However, here's where conspiracy theories live. It's when you take, like, just because it's possible that we live in the Matrix, we don't necessarily want to go around making that kind of bet that that's true, right? Like we don't want to go around believing fanciful things all the time, just because if we go around believing a lot of unlikely fanciful things, we're likely to make a lot of mistakes, right? But in the realm of news, people take things that are possible and turn them into things that are plausible. Now, what's plausible? What's plausible is something that has a set of facts, but with a story weaved around it. Okay, let me give you an example. I recently went to a neighbor's party, not very recently. This was like 3 weeks ago. Okay, but I wasn't being irresponsible before any social distancing happened. Okay. And part of it was like a murder mystery theme. So they said, go into this crime scene and create a story about what happened. So in the crime scene, there were facts, like there was a chair knocked over, there was like a statue on a desk, there was like some pieces of mail with some information, there were some feathers, right? And so these were all factual things. And what we all did was create a story, a plausible story tying all those things together. And it was hilarious because we had come up with the most fanciful things, like it was a murder, the bird did it, and the bird was standing on the statue, and this is what this piece of mail meant, right? So none of that was actually true, but it was a story that tied all the facts together. And people, when there's a story, it just makes it more believable, okay? So here's some examples in the real news right now. Okay, there are folks that really love Bernie Sanders, really hate Joe Biden, and they really hated Hillary Clinton. And there's a story about like the Democratic establishment. The story goes that Bernie shouldn't have actually lost all those the primaries that he lost. It was actually the Democratic establishment that literally changed votes to give them to vote to Joe Biden. Okay, so why is that plausible to some people? Okay, it's plausible because there are facts, there are like disparate facts that underlie things. Okay, so these disparate facts are things like here, let me these disparate facts are things like Joe Biden did not have a ground game in a lot of the states that he won. He didn't have any fundraising. He had smaller crowds. Bernie had bigger crowds. And somebody pointed this one out to me from they heard. Exit polls are typically very reliable, and they heard that exit polls did not match the actual polls. Okay, so putting all those things together, they said, you know what must have happened was that it wasn't possible that Joe Biden actually got all those votes. What happened was that a bunch of people in all these different states changed the votes from Bernie to Joe Biden. Okay, the problem with that is there's no actual proof for that major overarching story claim, right? So there, you could weave the story together, okay? And you could say, okay, if that follows so far. But then you take this huge step to say that means all the Democratic secretaries of state or people who are in charge of counting the votes actually switched votes. But there's no evidence of that, okay? So that's a problem with the plausible stories, is that they raise questions and they don't actually prove the overarching thing. Now there's a principle called there's a principle in philosophy called Occam's razor. So there's a couple ways of stating this principle, but of one of the ways is that of two competing theories, usually the simpler explanation of an entity is to be preferred. Okay. Another way it's stated is that plurality should not be positive without necessity. But really, if you think about it in simple terms, like if I noticed that my backpack got knocked over in my office, there would be a couple of explanations. There are infinite explanations for why that happened, right? One explanation is that aliens, the like magnetic force from a nearby alien spaceship knocked over the bag. Another one for which there's better evidence is that my dog just walked by it and knocked it over, right? And my dog is sleeping next to the bag and it's knocked over, right? So usually the simpler one is to be preferred. Again, it's possible that the crazier explanation is true, but which one would you want to make a bet on? And in life, which one do you want to go around making bets on in general? Okay. Another example of plausible stories that get a lot of traction right now are coronavirus conspiracy theories, and conspiracy theories in general. So I saw one going around the other day that was really special. It was about how like Bill Gates and Barack Obama recently put out a documentary about preventing a pandemic, and there was recently a conference about preventing a pandemic, and they talked about the need for preparation and like funding from private organizations. And so like there were these little factual underpinnings of things that happened, but then they extrapolated that into a story that Barack Obama and Bill Gates and the government and the media all conspired to create the coronavirus, deploy it from a factory in Wuhan and spread it all over the world for control or something like that. Okay. So again, there's no proof for the overarching story that ties it all together. But because there is an overarching story, it makes it plausible to people. And because there's underlying facts to it. When people don't realize that that gap is there of proof, that's where people run into problems. Okay, so when you're trying to explain this to students or to people that you're fighting with, I know a lot of you have this frustration, like, I can't believe people don't see this, right? How do you not, like, at a basic level understand this, right? So I'm going to give you a couple tools for that, right? If you have a student or somebody that you're arguing with that's giving you a plausible explanation but it's a very low probability one, and you have like the probable and likely explanation for it, you put the burden of proof on them. They'll often say, well, you can't prove that it's not true, but they can't prove that your thing's not true either, right? So if your thing is 80% likely to be true and their thing is 20% likely to be true, they have the burden of proof. Okay, don't let people throw the burden of proof on you. Anything that's possible or plausible is the one that has a burden of proof. Let's switch gears here and move on to trust of news sources themselves. And before we talk about how and why to trust news sources, I want to talk about how and why to distrust them. Okay. Where did my share thing go? I lost my controls here. All right. Okay. Reasons that people distrust good news sources. All right. Can you guys see this? Hopefully, yes. All right. So, unfortunately, you can't trust good news sources all the time. And not all bad news sources are bad all the time. That makes this really complicated, right? Because you can't just say, oh, just read a good news source. What does that mean? there are valid reasons for people to distrust news sources. One of them is mistakes. Good news sources make mistakes, sometimes very high profile mistakes. People will often point to a New York Times had a very high profile mistake in 2003, 2004 when they they did reporting on weapons of mass destruction and the likelihood of their existence, and that reporting and sourcing wasn't really very well vetted. It didn't really pass their editorial standards. They later apologized. I think the editor resigned. And one of the reporters, resigned in disgrace as well. And those things happen, right? There's also bad actors. So you can have people at good news sources that that let their own personal bias inappropriately affect the reporting of their stories. They can do unethical things. They can plagiarize. That's another example. Another reason people will distrust good news sources is that news sources typically, one of the standards for journalists is to report a thing that happens at the time that it happens once it's verified, right? They don't want to speculate on things that are happening in the future. Some do, but sometimes there's later discovered facts. And when people discover facts later that were hidden, then they'll say, see, the newspaper was lying in the first place. Okay, so we want to make sure we distinguish this. So take Jeffrey Epstein's suicide right now, right? Reputable news sources have reported that he committed a suicide because based on the best available information that's verifiable, that is what appears to have happened. However, even reputable news sources say there are some suspicious circumstances around whether he committed suicide or not, right? But they say that there's suspicion. What they're not going to say is that like Clinton did it or Trump did it, right? Because there's no evidence for that. But there are other facts and circumstances could be discovered in the future about Jeffrey Epstein's story, right? So say in the future, there was some famous person had Jeffrey Epstein murdered, right? And that comes to light. People will point to the earlier reporting and say, see, the newspaper lied, but they didn't lie. They were just reporting what was available at the time. Another reason people will distrust news sources is because it'll confuse fact reporting stories with analysis and opinion prediction type of content. And this is kind of a flaw that's inherent in our good news sources like the Washington Post and the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. They do have analysis and prediction content in there. So they'll point to, people will point, often Republicans today will point to the fact that many newspapers predicted with a probability that Hillary Clinton would win the election, and that turned out not to be true. And they say, see, they were wrong. They lied, okay? But they didn't lie. They were like the fact reporting stories said, here's a probability. And a probability is not like 100%. So the fact that they predicted that Hillary Clinton was favored, that wasn't a lie. Right, but people will point back to that because they have this concept of the true-false binary. And then I just touched on this. Good news sources often include some biased opinion content, and it's very influential. Like the New York Times and Washington Post and Wall Street Journal have large opinion sections, and those are biased, and they are just opinion, and they are not reporting. And I think that's a defect in our current news environment. But I'll save that soapbox for another day. Okay, reasons for trust of bad news sources. Oh, this is what gets me, okay? So even the InfoWarses of the world, InfoWars is such a terrible news source that it's been kicked off Facebook and Twitter and Google and YouTube. You have to be really, really terrible to get kicked off of those news sources. But not all the content on there is bad. Some of it is true. So, with InfoWars, only a third of the content is actually false or fake news or highly, highly misleading. That means 2/3 of it is not. And so I'll get people who defend InfoWars to me that say, well, it's not all bad. But that's not the standard for a good journalism organization. A good journalism organization should be factually correct about the same percentage of the time an airplane is in the air, okay? Like 99.99% of the time, the stuff in there should be factual and accurate. And it's a big problem if it's not. If 1/3 or 1/10 of the news stories are in a particular source are misleading or false, that's terrible. That is a terrible, terrible news source. And the other thing is that even some of that bad content, that 1/3 or 1/10, is plausible, okay? And we covered what plausible means earlier. So how do you tell if not all good news sources are good all the time, or not all bad news sources are wrong all the time? How do you tell? So I won't. I don't want to frustrate you too much. Here's one strategy. One thing. Let me share. All right. One resource, and how we deal with this, how we do this at Adfontes Media, is on our media bias chart. Okay, you guys have probably seen our interactive media bias chart, and this interactive part is important because what we do here's like here are all of our aggregate news source ratings. These are all weighted averages of individual article scores. Okay, so these dots represent the individual articles that we have rated for all of these news sources. All right, so let's take a look at something like the New York Times. Okay, so New York Times, so most of their articles are up here in the middle, and there's some left-leaning opinion in there. Okay, some neutral opinion analysis. All right, so the weighted average comes up here. But let's take a look at something like InfoWars. Okay. All right. See, here's a problem. A lot of this stuff is in this most extreme, accurate, inaccurate, fabricated. A lot of this stuff is terrible, but then some of the stuff is not bad. It's plausible. Okay. And you can start to see the differences. Why this is useful is because we take a large sample. Not everybody has the resources to be able to read all this many articles for this many news sources and figure out, okay, what percentage of the time does this one have a high score for veracity and a high score for expression versus the percentage of time they have a low score for expression, a low score for veracity. You can see this with our online stuff, like Fox News. This is for the TV content, okay? The internet content is a bit higher into the middle, okay? But if you look at MSNBC over here, okay, you'll see that different spread, okay? It's important to have these weighted averages of individual scores because then you can see the subtle differences between each news source. So notice that, you know, MSNBC and Fox are not exactly mirror images of each other, right? They're different aspects for their individual articles and overall source scores. All right. Running towards the top of the hour, and I want to leave time for questions. Okay. So if you can't rely on one news source 100% of the time, what can you rely on besides this media bias chart, you know, where we're rating all these sources and telling you what's at the top, okay? What I want to encourage you to do is to rely on the news ecosystem. So we can rely on large dispersed information ecosystems that are comprised of professionals that have inherent checks and balances built into them. So we have several kinds of ecosystems like this, like science, law, medicine, and journalism are really big ones, okay? Because there are a couple of things that all of these fields have in common. The authority is somewhat decentralized. There are a lot of high-profile academics, scientists, lawyers, doctors, journalists, right? It's not just like one locus of control. And the larger the field and the more distributed the authorities are within it, the less likely it is the whole field is trying to mislead you personally, right? So in journalism, we can rely on the news ecosystem because the whole job of journalists is to fact report and fact check. And if something else is wrong in another news source, they have large incentive to go find out that that is the case and write it up immediately. That's why we can rely on something called lateral reading, which I'll get to in a minute. Okay, so when we have a news ecosystem like we do, and we're really fortunate in the United States that we, you know, as much as it's under attack and as much as the journalism industry has struggled in recent years, we have a very robust information ecosystem. So we use the information sources within the news ecosystem to triangulate, like to figure out where the information you're reading at a particular time is positioned within this universe of information. All right, so let's talk about actual strategies. Let me share this again. Where'd it go? Okay. Okay, so you want to start with having a go-to of long-standing reputable sources. Long-standing, like AP, Reuters, you know, the major national newspapers like LA Times, major local newspapers, things like that, major network like ABC, NBC, CBS. And not because they've just you know, they're ranked high on the chart. It's because there are other factors about them that give them incentive to continue affecting good journalism. They have a lot of resources invested in their journalism staff. They have large journalism staffs. They need to appeal to a wide audience, and any hits in their credibility really impacts their business model. So there are a number of these reasons why you want to have these long-standing reputable sources that you can cross-check against regularly. So, and say you have 6 or 8 of those that you can go to. If one of them gets something wrong, that's okay. The other ones will figure it out that that one got it wrong, okay? News sources can become reputable over time, and there are some really, really good new news sources. So how can they become reputable? With good veracity and good expression ratings and minimal bias ratings in our system over time, and minimal mistakes over those short periods of time. So news sources like ProPublica, The Information, there's one called The Popular Information by a journalist called Judd Legume. These are newer sources, but because of their high veracity and expression scores, if you can come to trust those over time, and we rate them over time, they can become reputable. So, but what do you do with an unknown source? Because there's a lot of unknown sources out there. So we want to do our best to triangulate when you come across something new. You want to go to other facts. You want to do, I'm missing a big bullet point here. The top bullet point here should be called lateral reading. Let me share a different screen. Lateral reading. Okay, so one of the only studies out there is done by Weinberg and McGrew at Stanford in 2017 that showed that the easiest way to figure out whether something's true or not is not by reading deeply into one piece of one web page, but by rather reading laterally against other sources. Clicking around on the internet, basically. So what I'm telling you to do, and what I'm telling you to tell your students to do, is to click around on the internet. Specifically, what do I mean by clicking around on the internet? Go to fact-checking sites. Okay, that's stop number 1. Okay, for things like coronavirus right now, these resources are invaluable. They're amazing. They have full teams of journalists. Like, go to factcheck.org, PolitiFact, and Snopes.com have whole sections just on the coronavirus now. There is no reason for people to be believing Facebook posts written by their friend that was a nurse or something that have no citations. Go to these organizations, all right? But not everything is on here. Not everything is fact checkable. Sometimes you'll have stuff that's just not on here yet. And in that case, second stop is other news sources. So if you find something that you have reason to question, okay, or something that you'd have reason to, reason to question would be something that wants you to take a particular action, wants to convince you of something that is of consequence. For example, here was a really tough one in the past few days. Okay, There was an article on medium.com. Medium is a site where anybody can post a blog. And somebody who had some credibility in their field, in his field of expertise, but he was not an epidemiologist or scientist or biologist. He is a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. Did his own analysis with lots of numbers about like how bad coronavirus epidemic was going to be, and his bias was towards it's not going to be that bad. This is all a bunch of hysteria. Okay, so this was really hard for people to figure out whether it was true or not because there was a lot of numbers. It was really long. He seemed kind of credible. So with something like that, you have to triangulate. You've got to look around to see what other sources on the internet are saying about it. Okay, because if you have sources of competing reliability, like this Medium post, later other biologists and scientists started writing about what was wrong with that article and disputing it and refuting it. Okay, if you didn't read around, you wouldn't know that. Okay, so whenever you that post was ultimately taken down by Medium because it was misleading. So on something that's that important and consequential, if you have one piece of information that you're relying on, that's not enough. You need to go around like fact-checking sites, other reputable news sources, and if all else fails, Google. If you have something that you question, Google the particular phrase that you're questioning and see what other people are saying about it. If you find something that gives you a lot of pause and you're really not sure to believe it, and if it was really true, it would be a big deal to and others would be reporting it, but you're not finding it elsewhere, that's a big red flag that you shouldn't believe it. Okay, what else? I want to leave you with a couple of things. I'm going to share this. I'm going to put this up on my site as well. But I created this a few weeks ago. I'm getting some chats here. Sorry, it's hard to see the chats. Okay. So this, I apologize. There's some like internet snarky slang on here because I made this in 2017 before like we became a real company. But I'll share this with you. It's useful anyways. So top 6 red flags that a news story is unreliable, disreputable, or embarrassing for you to share. So these are conspiracy theory red flags that are really useful. Again, I'll share this on the site. And it'll be available in the Zoom recording as well. But when people are saying that, the article says that it is telling the truth and everyone else is lying to you, like, we know the truth, or what the media or government or corporations are hiding you. This is what they're hiding from you, or this is definitely true. Like, your BS detector should say that if they have to preface it by swearing it's true, that should be a big red flag. Okay, I'm going to skip down to some on the bottom that we sort of covered today. Like, it puts a burden on you to answer the questions. Like, it has statements such as, if you can't answer these questions, or do you really know what happened? That's not a sign of journalism. Like, a journalist is supposed to tell you what happened, not ask you questions and ask you what happened. Okay, they'll ask you to prove a negative. Like, they'll say no one has proven that the government wasn't involved. And again, like we covered before, the burden of proof is on the thing that's less likely to be so. The other big one that just shows up a lot, especially in the coronavirus stories, is it suggests an insidious plot by someone, like some big boogeyman, like the media or elites or corporations or the government. And sometimes they're even more specific. Like, sometimes they're big pharma, or the Koch brothers, or George Soros, right? Big boogeyman, but it doesn't actually say what the plot is or provide any evidence for it. They'll say things like, no one knows how deep this goes, and there's no telling who's behind all of this. Those are your really big red flags for conspiracy theories. All right, so I've come up to the end of the hour and I've like taken all the time, but I will stay on for questions because I'm sure you have some. This is, of course, not everything that we could possibly cover about how to tell what's true in the news, but it's a good start. We do this at Adfontes Media. Like we have tools for teaching students how to rate veracity. We'll have this content online as well. We'll have we have our CART platform that has you have a 30-day free trial if you're interested in that. So I'll open it up for questions. If you want to take yourself off mute, then go ahead.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to know, all the chat text, is that going to be in the recording?
Yes.
Oh, excellent, because I didn't get a chance to read it and there's some good stuff in there. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, there's some comments. I've kind of been glancing at them, but it's hard to multitask. So yeah, these will be available on the recording. So I'm going to email out this recording, and I'm also going to post it on our site. It'll be on an accessible part of the site that everybody could see.
Hi, Vanessa.
Yes.
You mentioned really quick toward the end that you mentioned some newer sources are good.
Mm-hmm.
And I was scribbling, but I just couldn't get them that quick.
Yeah, no problem. So ProPublica, that's already rated and on our site. It's in one of those areas. It's kind of hard to see. It's been around for several years. I want to say it started like sometime between 2008 and 2010, but I could be wrong there. But within the last 10 or 12 years. And it's a nonprofit news organization. They do a lot of in-depth investigative reporting. There's one called The Information. That's a subscription service. It's specifically about tech news. So like it's based in Silicon Valley, and it's a pretty well paywalled, and it's a fairly high-end subscription rate. I think it's like $300 a year. And then Popular Information by Judd Legume. You can follow him on Twitter, and his beat. So a lot of people like independent journalists, and I say like take independent journalists sometimes with a grain of salt. Like allow them to build up a reputation before you trust them, because you want to get familiar with like what their beat is. Like one person can't cover everything, and they don't need to cover everything, but like this Popular Information, he has a free newsletter that you can sign up for, and he has a paid subscription. It's $50 per year. I think it's quite reasonable, but his beat is Facebook and Twitter, practices that spread misinformation, like when their ad policies, they do something wrong with the ad policies, or they're spreading certain kind of misinformation, or they have some kind of data privacy breach, or things like that. They've uncovered a lot of stuff, and one of the reasons you can tell that this reporting is reputable is because when you triangulate it against other news sources will pick up his reporting, confirm it, re-report it, and in many cases Facebook has taken action because of his reporting. Like they've stopped doing a thing that they were doing that was bad.
Vanessa,
yes,
are you going to make available to us your either your PowerPoint or the PDFs that you used during your presentation today?
Yes, I'll email that as well, because it should be you should be able to see it during the recording, but the PDF will be easier for you to use, and feel free to use that in your classes.
Great, thank you. I've enjoyed the All Sides website so much, and looking at the bias charts. The kids love it.
Awesome. Bill, you had a question?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for all of this, and I'm looking forward to getting that material. I posted in the chat, I showed your chart to a friend who questioned the precision of 2 decimal places. And because I'm not familiar with your techniques, I couldn't solidly answer him. How many data points do you use to triangulate?
So what we do is for each, you can actually see this on our CART platform because we teach students how to do this. We look at 4 factors for reliability and 4 factors for bias. Our analysts, when we rate we publish an article rating, 3 of our analysts, somebody with left, center, and right political positions, has looked at that one article, and our score is the average of their overall score. So they have sliders like from, your friend is right in a way, okay? The precision of like the 2 decimal places, it gives a false impression that that's like the ultimate truth correct score, okay? But really what that score is an average of 3 people's scores, okay? And we're saying that because they fell within a standard deviation within our system, that score is valid, okay? So that means that, let's say we have a left-leaning opinion article that we're rating, and we have a left-leaning person, a right-leaning person, and a center-leaning person rating it. All 3 of them are saying that it's in this area, it's in the left-leaning opinion area, right? But their scores will be off by like a few numbers each, depending on their own internal, like they've taken in so many different things, right? They're humans. So the numerical score is an average, but like I wouldn't consider the exact dot like the ultimate truth of that placement. I'd consider like the area where it's placed is like a good indicator of the likely truth of that placement. Make sense?
It makes complete sense to me. I don't know that it's going to make sense to a person who doesn't want to believe it or doesn't want to interpret it. And
Yeah, for sure.
they do.
Yeah, I got a really good question before it gets at your question before this conference call, and it was with a little tone of despair, like, this is great for all of you guys who are on this call who love the truth and the news and care about this stuff and took an hour out of your day to listen to this. But what about like the people who like need to know this information the most are not on this call, right? How do we convince somebody, especially when they like look at this and then they just dismiss it out of hand, okay? So what Advantage Media is all about is trying to make as big a difference as we can in by providing news content ratings. And there's 3 levels of that. We can show, we can teach, and we can apply. Okay, so showing is what we're doing right now, where we rate the news and then we put it on the chart, and then people come to the site and they say, oh, that's where Ed Fontes rated the sources, and I believe that, and so thank you for showing me, right? And you can use that to inform your own decisions about the news that you consume. But then there's everybody else that doesn't come to the site, right? So we can't show them. But you as teachers, you can do the second step, which is teach, okay? So it's one thing for us to rate the news, but it's another thing for you to teach people to rate the news themselves, and that's what we ultimately want, okay? So we can teach the next generation of folks to be news literate by teaching them to evaluate news sources according to a system like the system that we have, okay? But again, not everybody is going to get to be in your classes, unfortunately. Not everybody's going to be on the seminar. So how do we reach folks and change make a substantial difference in the way people receive information in the world? Well, the third thing we can do is apply news source ratings. I think we really need news source content ratings for reliability and bias with systems that using systems that people can have some trust and faith in. So ideally, independent third-party ratings companies, nonpartisan ratings companies doing this kind of work can be like the backbone for this kind of system. So it doesn't have to be just Ad Fontes. There are other companies that rate the news as well. There's one called NewsGuard as well. All Sides of Media Bias Fact Check. They do left-right bias ratings. So when like all these third-party ratings companies are saying, this is where this news source falls, it's like a different function from fact-checking organizations. So I think we need to have fact-checking organizations, and we need to have news content ratings organizations, and news content, Ad Fontes Media is one of those, because we can use these scores to apply ratings to the ways people get information distributed. There are good stakeholders in journalism, like publishers themselves, social media platforms, advertisers, and each of these stakeholders should care that they're supporting and promoting good journalism, and demoting and labeling and warning people against the junk content. Okay, but we need to have a way to differentiate between them. So our goal is to apply it so that advertisers, social media platforms can use our ratings to make these decisions. Like imagine if in your whole Twitter feed and your whole Facebook feed, each one was labeled with like a score from where it would land on the media bias chart. That would, I think, be helpful. It wouldn't solve the whole problem, but it would be helpful.
Vanessa,
Yes.
do you have a crib sheet or line card of all of these websites for the fact checking that you use?
No, but I can throw it together. Yes.
Sounds easy. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's mainly those three ones, and then there's the other news content rating sites that I can throw together. I'll put that as an extra slide in this presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, somebody said like calorie ratings and fast food joints. Absolutely, junk news is like junk food, and they used to not be nutrition labels, but now there are. And even though nutrition labels don't solve the whole problem, there is a whole industry, a health food industry, and people making better decisions because of that. All right. I'll stick around for questions. You feel free to jump off. We're like way past the hour here, and I really appreciate your time and attendance. It's been awesome.
Thank you for the last 3 presentations you've had over this last week.
Oh, my
I
pleasure.
really enjoyed it.
It gives me life to, connect with you all. So thank you for being here. I know you guys are all leaders. You folks are all leaders out in your communities with your teachers and your classes. And it's a lot of work during this challenging time, but it's important to do it.
Let's hope fact checking goes viral.
Yeah, I hope it does.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Vanessa,
Yes.
is there any way to determine what objectively is newsworthy and what is not? Because I find the biggest difference between the cable news channels isn't so much how they cover the news, but it's which stories they decide to cover, which ones they consider newsworthy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's not really a great definition of newsworthy. Ezra Klein talks about this in his book, Why We're Polarized as well. But I think there's an internal metric that we use for newsworthiness that we call importance. So basically, what's newsworthy in for journalism organizations takes into account what like draws people's attention, like what people want to read and click on, just because there's like the business model incentive, right? Like there's incentives for clicks and views. But in our if we're comparing 2 stories in a news source, we can compare like which one's more important than another. And the metrics that we use for that are things like, does it affect, like the most important thing would be like something that directly affects you and everyone else. So the coronavirus is a perfect, like a very important story, okay? An important story would be something like a level below that would be like something that affects a lot of people, but not you. Okay, so like a hurricane or an earthquake in another country, like a really, really big one. Okay, just next level of importance, kind of close but tied, almost tied. It's something that affects you, but or affects one person very, very badly. Okay. So like a murder of somebody else in your town, right? That's it only affects one person, doesn't affect you, doesn't affect a lot of people, but it affected one person very, very importantly. And then as you go down the list, it has less to do with like it's less important to you, it affects you very little, the less important it is. So things like the things that the president says and does. So is that newsworthy? Well, sometimes it's more newsworthy than other times, because if the president is going to announce a policy, right, or the Congress is going to announce a policy that will affect you in some way, maybe not super directly, but like if it's about healthcare, that might affect you very directly. If it's about your taxes, it might affect you very directly. If it's about, you know, like those would be still important. If it's about like some White House palace intrigue, like some like rumor about something stupid the president said. Okay, the president said it, but does it really affect you? Like, is it that important? Probably not, so we'd rank it lower. But a lot of stories are like that. Like, you know, we devalue gossip and tabloid stuff because it's not only is it not about you, it doesn't affect you, it doesn't affect society, it's about something you totally don't know, and like and it's never going to affect your life, like celebrity gossip. Make sense? So we that is one of the things that we take into account. Sorry, this is kind of a long-winded answer, but a lot of the things that are covered on cable news are really not that newsworthy. You know, you can watch a whole 6 hours of CNN. Like aside from the current news cycle, think back, you know, 3 months ago. Whatever the 24-hour news cycle was of that day, they wouldn't cover like all these important things. Like you can watch CNN for 6 hours and learn like 52 different news stories. You learn like 4 news stories. Like one of them would be like a hurricane or fire, and then the other 3 would be things Trump said or did. And then they have 10 people talking about their opinion of what Trump said or did. So those we rank lower because they're not as newsworthy, because it doesn't, like things Trump said or did, some of them are important, but some of them are just not as important to you in your daily life or society as a whole.
Vanessa?
Yeah.
One other comment too.
Mm-hmm.
We did an experiment. We monitored ABC World News and actually timed how much news coverage they got versus how much was the promotional information, other things in commercials. And we were appalled by the numbers that came back from that. And we started looking at other news sources. We had a phenomenally interesting assessment actually occur as a direct result of that. So the amount that we're exposed to is very different than we think it is sometimes. I just wanted to say that
I'm
might
sure
be another variable in the equation for all of that.
I'd love for you to share that if you could. Do you have that study information?
I did. My computer crashed and I'm struggling with the recovery right now. If I can, I will get that to you.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's super important to measure. I mean, if you just look at volume of things that are important to cover, one of the reasons I really, really like The Economist as a news source is because there's a 2-page spread that you can read about 32 like paragraphs that are each individual news sources about stuff that happened around the world. And you could just read those 2 pages and know more about what happened around the world that week than if you watched like 6 hours of cable news.
That what you said about the difference between the left and the right in cable news, Fox versus CNN. I watch CNN a lot, but that they preservate on, like you say, on a few stories, and they just go over and over again those stories. An example was when Trump made the call, is calling the virus Chinese virus. Okay, so the left, you know, just went crazy over that. And they just go over and over again about how it's racism and xenophobic without and only a few of my CNN friends will start out by saying, well, you know, it really did originate in China. So it is not factually incorrect to call it a Chinese virus. But there, meanwhile, a few weeks earlier, the on Fox are going crazy over what Schumer said when he used Supreme Court and you know, and terrible consequences in the same sentence, and it was barely noted on CNN. So depending on which side you're on, something is far more important in politics than it is to the other side, and so you really do have to triangulate and search on the reputable sources to get perspective, because if you just listen to to one, you're going to be, especially the videos, the TVs, you're going to get a distorted view.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ideal if I was in charge of like how news should be, like I would create a definition of like newsworthiness that would be like very close to our definitions of importance, and say like the best sources are the ones that cover the most important stuff, and important like of all the things that you could cover about the coronavirus right now, like spending hours deconstructing, like Trump calling it the Chinese virus, I don't think is the most newsworthy or important. I'm not saying it's of zero. I'm not saying it's of zero of importance. Like certainly there's like implications in terms of like discrimination and how it affects people in our
Yeah.
country, like exacerbating racial tensions. But of all the news sources, like news stories, it's certainly not the most important one to fixate and spend a lot of time on. When a news source has the resources and capability to disseminate a lot of important information to a lot of people.
Vanessa,
Yes.
is there any source for rating media for their breadth of coverage of newsworthy or important, as you rate it, news?
Not that I know
You're
of.
aware of.
I think it's just, yeah, this is an emerging field, and so there's not a lot of companies that like rate what the news is. So like I'd say like we're pretty much it, and but in terms of like, I just know personally for our methodology, we take into account importance, and like whole source ratings are part of what we do, where we like we'll look at the not just like the individual article, but like the like number of topics on a certain page are part of some of our rankings. So yeah, I don't know, Vaughn.
Is there a place on your site to access that? I haven't noticed that
No,
particular.
we just use it for our weightings on the back end.
Okay.
Yeah.
It might be an interesting thing to report on.
Yeah. No, it is. It's just a lot of data.
Yeah.
Like we've had analysts like count the number of like percentage of stories that are like fact and opinion and analysis, but we just haven't done it for every single one of our news sources. It's just a lot of time and effort. So like, go ahead.
Other than The Economist, do you have any others that are sort of top of mind?
For U.S. news, like the New York Times, Washington Post, and AP and Reuters.
Yeah.
Just because, I mean, AP and Reuters, because they're the wire services, and the thing that they have in these sources have in common is they have the most journalists. AP has 2,000, Reuters has close to that amount. Washington Post and New York Times over the years have fluctuated between like 500 and 1,000 people. There's a lot of people covering the news, and that's that's more than like even an organization like CNN, like in the United States. I think like CNN can broadcast their what they broadcast for 200 and some like journalists and newsroom staff. Those other sources that I mentioned like have more reporters out in the field, which allows them to have more breadth of coverage. AP and Reuters.
Did we lose Vanessa?
She
I think
froze up.
sometimes if it was timed, it'll just shut off automatically.
Yeah, that might be the case.
All right.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Farewell. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Vanessa.
Hey guys, sorry, my internet completely went out, but I guess the meeting's over anyways. So thank you all for coming, and I apologize for that last little technical difficulty. Thanks. Bye.